Okay, thank you. It is October 26, 2021, and this is the meeting of the Vermont Climate Council, one of its
Did other folks just have Secretary Young freeze up on her? Okay.
approve the minutes of October 19, and those are in the chat as David on for folks who have not had an opportunity to review them. We will have a guest today, Senator Rahm Hinsdale, who will be talking to us during our Just Transitions reflection about the draft environmental justice legislation. We are going to talk about the application of the Just Transition scoring rubric with the co-chairs of the committee, our consultant Kaya Morse. We are going to be reviewing the carbon budget and taking a break, and then reviewing the sector proportionality and cost of carbon and social cost of carbon documents. And then we will be reviewing additional science and data sections in the climate action plan. We'll have public comment at 4:20. These times are always estimated, TBD, as we move through. And then we will be adjourning on or around 4:30.
Great. So, Secretary Young, you're having a few connection challenges today, apparently, because you cut out just a little bit. I don't know if you can still hear me. We'll give Secretary Young just a second. Secretary Young, we're having a few connectivity challenges with you today. So your audio and video are cutting out periodically.
Okay.
But we heard you go through the agenda, so we got that. Is there anything else before we get going, Secretary Young?
No, I think I just wanted to, since you will be facilitating the rest of the agenda, to welcome Senator Rahm Hinsdale when it's her to speak. We appreciate her joining us. I will turn off my camera, see if that helps with the audio.
Right. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. Any questions or concerns about the agenda before we jump into it from council members? Okay, great. We do have our normal thing of wanting to approve the minutes. We've been posting the link in the chat a couple times because they're not hyperlinked onto the agenda, although they have been posted online for several days. So I just want to give folks a moment to click through to that. And if there's anything folks want to bring up in terms of concerns about the minutes from our last meeting last week, now's the time to do that. So I'll give folks just a second. Okay, does anybody need more time to look at the minutes or have any concerns about those minutes? Okay, I'm not seeing concerns or hearing requests for more time, so let's consider those minutes to be approved. Thanks, everybody. Okay, and I'm just seeing if we have Senator Rahm here with us. Does anybody see Senator Rahm on our scene right now? I'm not sure I see her. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Senator Rahm Hinsdale to join us, why don't we go to the next piece, which is connected to this, and it's a reflection of how we're doing in our subcommittees in applying the just transitions principles and the matrix, the rubric. And we wanted to hear from subcommittee co-chairs about that. And also Kaya Morris is here, who's our consultant on this work. And so she can provide some updates as well from her perspective, how things are going. But this was one of the two things we wanted to do in this early slot of our meeting, in addition to hear about what's going on with the draft environmental justice legislation. So I'm still not seeing Senator Rahm right now, unless I'm missing that. So why don't we pivot into how it's going in our own work, in our own subcommittees, in doing the just transitions work. And our thought here was to let co-chairs talk a little bit about the process, how it's going, how it may have changed your thinking about what you want to frame up as what you can provide as a deliverable to the council and what the council can do, given the work you're doing. So with that, I wonder if I might just walk through with some of the subcommittees to get a quick update about how that process is going of doing that detailed equity analysis and just transitions scoring rubric analysis. So Jane, is there, yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that Senator Ron Hinsdale just joined.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so
and that she was technically on the agenda for 1:40. So
all right.
Surprisingly, we're ahead of ourselves, Senator Rom. So welcome. And I know Secretary Young wanted to welcome you to our meeting today. So let me turn it back to Secretary Young for that.
Thank you. I just wanted to welcome you, Ram Hinsdale. I may be having some audio issues, so if you can't hear me, I'm sure someone will let you know, but we look forward to your presentation on the environmental justice legislation.
Great. Well, thank you, Secretary Young. That might be the last time I'm introduced by you, so I'll take the opportunity to wish you luck in your next chapter as well, and thank you for your many decades of service.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll just jump right in since it sounds like you're on a good clip here. For those of you who don't know me, Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale. I wouldn't call myself necessarily an environmental justice scholar anymore. It was my 100-page thesis when I was a senior in the Rubenstein School. And in 2007, I worked with then Representative Rachel Weston to introduce Vermont's first environmental justice policy, very sparse at the time, more reflective of the early experiences. This was almost 15 years ago. So the earlier experiences with environmental justice policy that you really need to start with a working group, a nod to the kind of indices that you need to put in place to have a good mapping tool to map environmental distress, down to the census tract or the zip code. And, environmental justice was a really robust and growing, scientific, rigorous sort of academic set of principles at the time. As folks may know, I mentioned this in the Rev gathering this morning. Tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the National People of Color Environmental Summit that happened. That really wasn't when people of color entered the environmental movement, but tried to put the white folks in the environmental movement on notice that they had been left out of a really gourmet version of the environmental movement. And as I said before, as someone who's Indian, I would say Indian women chaining themselves to trees was probably, the first kind of environmental activism that we saw centuries ago. So, that is sort of the context in which I wanted to come and share what the S-148 would do, which builds on the 2007 language and also builds on, I'll say a couple things. It builds in a lot of great thinking that's taken place in states that have very robust environmental justice legislation. So California, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Massachusetts most recently has added more clear definitions around what environmental costs and environmental benefits are. And that's something we can really gain a lot from. As well, the EPA has added flooding information to EJ Screen, the national mapping tool that states can use as their building block for the kind of indices that they want to use to understand environmental distress and impact. I hope you do this every day, but I want to thank Kaya Morris and the BIPOC affinity space that she has set up because that allowed us to do our best to fulfill one of the major principles of environmental justice, which is that you have procedural justice and that you invite the people most impacted into the conversation from the beginning to the end. And that, there are often need to be things in place to hamstring policy so that it doesn't move forward without the explicit involvement and consent of communities of color, low-income communities, and those most impacted. So sounds like you all are on your way to building those principles into your work. And I would just encourage that as much as possible. Some of you may know I worked with some of our academic organizations that are involved in your work, VLS, UVM, and others to try and travel the state and remind people that they are environmental experts, because they know where their kids play. They, are trying to figure out what their kids can safely eat. They walk by blighted areas, or they know if their basement is flooded and full of mold. That makes them worthy of, having their expertise valued. And that's a really important principle for us. So I thought I would share my screen, if that makes sense, and just go through the bill so that you have something visual to look at. Does that work?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay. And I just kind of, sorry for those of you who are at Rev this morning, there's a lot of the same pieces, and some people are hearing this maybe the third or fourth time. Some people have not had the opportunity to hear this yet. So I hope everyone can see that. But S-148 is an environmental justice bill that had the input of some folks who are around the table here. So here's just a little bit of what was something from, I mentioned that UVM Vermont Law School collaboration, Rejoice, which a lot of people in this group have heard from. Rejoice around rural environmental justice and the collaborative we created. When UVM did a canvassing around some of the impacted communities in the state, they, I think it was scientifically and sort of rigorously done so that they could have a good sample size, et cetera. And they found that BIPOC Vermonters were 7 times more likely to have gone without heat in the past year, over 2 times more likely to have trouble affording electricity, and 7 times less likely to own a solar panel than white Vermonters. Folks may also know something in the 76% range, I believe, of Black Vermonters and BIPOC Vermonters report being nature deprived, and it's only in the 20% range for white Vermonters. So I used this as well this morning in Rev because the disparity is a little bit bigger for the whole state. It's 22% of Black Vermonters are homeowners, 72% of white Vermonters. This is Chittenden County, where it's a little bit less than 50%, a huge disparity of Black Vermonters in Chittenden County who own versus white Vermonters their homes. So many of the programs and the emissions reductions and the things we're talking about benefit homeowners, and so often people are completely left behind if they aren't able to access homeownership. This is many of our environmental justice grants have come to mobile home communities. It's starting in 1999. So environmental justice was a sort of known quantity before we introduced that bill, but in certain pockets. And those pockets were with rural white Vermonters who were experiencing sewage backup, a lack of access to clean drinking water, poor roads, and poor, recreational space in and around their mobile home communities. There's a huge environmental justice conversation that's probably going to take place this year about moving some of these mobile home communities to higher ground. That there are so many environmental justice principles that would serve us well if we're really trying to have that conversation in an equitable and earnest way. And as folks may know, mobile home park residents, or mobile home residents, I should say, whether they were in a park or not, made up in 2011, 8% of the state population, but 40% of those impacted by Tropical Storm Irene. So here is the kind of foundational principles of an environmental justice policy. It has to have substantive, procedural, and distributive justice. The substantive piece, some states are starting to put into constitutional changes, constitutional amendments themselves to say that everyone deserves, as a basic right and privilege of citizenship or, presence here in the US, clean air, clean water, access to recreation, healthy homes, healthcare, and fresh food. You will see these show up. I was really, for those of you who weren't there, felt like I ate my Wheaties this morning because I've just been talking a lot to federal partners about Justice 40. I encourage you to look up Justice 40. It's a kind of principled approach to how community and environmental resources are distributed in the country that's moving its way through the infrastructure bill. It has the support of the White House, and it has a lot to do with the kinds of things we're talking about here, that if everyone is supposed to enjoy these amenities equally, then we have to actually take the money, run it through, working groups and folks who represent the communities that have been under-resourced, and get, a big chunk of that money to people who haven't benefited from it before. So we would be well served to have an environmental justice working group to be able to accommodate the Justice 40 principles that are, I think, likely to continue to make their way through in the infrastructure bill. Procedural justice, we talked a little bit about public participation, access to information. Language access is huge. It's a huge civil rights compliance issue for us right now. And if folks don't know, many states and municipalities have started to develop language access plans because we won't have the money to do language access everywhere it's needed, but there are civil rights, sort of principles that come out of litigation that say you really have to start with life-saving, services and communication. So, we went in flooding, in even a slow-moving disaster like the pandemic. People who don't speak English cannot be left behind for days, for weeks, without access to information in their language. That is completely unacceptable from a basic human rights perspective, but also from a civil rights compliance perspective. And so we have a separate language access bill as well. But, for you all to know, some of this disaster resiliency work is about basic language compliance, as well as helping people understand hazards and pollution in their communities. And finally, the distributive justice. This idea is becoming more foundational in definitions that you cannot have certain communities shouldering a greater distribution of the costs or the burdens, environmental burdens, than the benefits. And I think that's important because you'll have a lot of people say, I'm experiencing environmental injustice. I don't want to look at this. I don't want this undesirable land use in my community. I don't want something that, causes emissions in my community. Well, when everyone says that, and some people have more political power than other people, those undesirable land uses, those polluting entities, those all get put in communities that lack political power. And those communities that lack political power are obviously often civil rights protected communities, who have protected status, like people of color, and you also have this preponderance of environmental burden in low-income communities. So it's often that intersection of pollution, power, and poverty that, leads to environmental injustice being concentrated in certain zip codes and communities. S148 is, introduced, which is great. And I really am advocating for its passage this coming year and hoping that ANR and the Climate Council and other entities that you all represent will be supportive of its passage. Could always be improved. It, probably could benefit from more of a budget. And I left that question open to the natural resources committees because, they have more of a sense of the ANR budget, the interagency operability that's needed. And, appropriations is better at having those budget questions, given often our limitations, but right now I think our real opportunity to expand what civil rights looks like out of ANR, but it's attached to other departments and agencies as well. Department of Health will need to be involved. Agency of Transportation already has really strict federal guidelines around environmental justice that they're probably following somewhat, with somewhat of success, and housing and other kinds of agencies and departments like that. So the bill has findings and definitions. I would say the BIPOC affinity space had, the most opportunity to weigh in here and look at, the way that we can build off of the EPA definition from 25 years ago with the great work of California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, as I said, who have all infused, New Jersey's huge contribution was accumulation of burden. So not just saying, let's look at these factors one at a time. California has really stringent and comprehensive mapping and, is a kind of pathway to how you map inequity. And Massachusetts has gone through multiple iterations, and their latest one has a lot on climate justice and environmental costs and burdens and how you define a community that has too many of those environmental costs or burdens, as well as benefits. And so, the goal is to include environmental justice in the mission and framework of the state agencies that have a civil rights reporting requirement, and as folks may know, the EPA has asked us multiple times to have an environmental justice framework in Vermont. We're considerably behind other states. We're one of maybe the last 8 states that doesn't have an environmental justice framework we can point to in statute as a backbone to our civil rights and environmental compliance. It still includes that environmental justice advisory group. As I said, there's probably more reason with what's coming down the federal pike and the principles it includes to have built that trust and have a sense of who the most impacted marginalized communities are and have them at the table. I think that section could continually be improved. Some people feel like there's missing lenses and you want to have a preponderance or majority of impacted communities over kind of agency heads so that their voices really carry in that advisory group. As you probably all know better than I do, or at least as well as I do, we have a part-time officer of civil rights. I don't believe they've gone to full-time yet in ANR. I hope, this bill can spur more statutory requirements that allow them to be justified as a full-time staff person, as well as that office should eventually be expanded. We are just, we don't have enough civil rights compliance embedded in ANR, whereas, the federal EPA has, a civil rights office essentially, and they have been asking us to do more in that regard. Finally, a mapping tool is really critical so that we're looking at distress. We're not saying, let's just go with the community that has the biggest staff that wants this pilot project or, wants to fix up their environmental infrastructure. We really need to be looking at who is otherwise left behind and making sure that resources go to them. So this will change how environmental personnel and funds should be distributed in the state to get at the communities that are experiencing more flooding, more pollution, higher asthma rates, have vulnerability to heat or to inhabitability because of flooding, et cetera. We should be able to map that. And here's just one example. This is Los Angeles. So not that we're anything like Los Angeles, but this is an index of lead paint, and it's overlay, you can overlay it with the communities that are most vulnerable. You can overlay it with renters versus homeowners. You can overlay it with communities of color or low-income communities. And, that helps us when we look at lead paint. It's a huge issue in Vermont, and being able to start to track where are the hot spots of, these kinds of environmental costs and burdens or vulnerabilities, and where do we see, a disproportionate number of people who are otherwise marginalized, historically marginalized and underrepresented. We can start to build a heat map that tells us where we need to be distributing more resources and support. And that is my presentation. Okay, here we go.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for that presentation. By the way, my name is David Plum, and I'm helping to run these meetings. It's nice to meet you. I don't think we've ever met before. And we have some time, if you're open for it, for Climate Council members to ask some questions about this bill and about the initiative. So I open it up for members of the Climate Council. If you have questions for Senator Ram Hinsdale, this is a great time to ask those, or comments or reactions to what you're seeing.
I think while people are working on that, I just would ask, I know having Kaya engaged is such an important step. Are you following environmental justice principles as you do your work? How are you trying to change the power dynamics so that, people who are most impacted are also more heard in the process? And so, even just saying, like, I invite council members to speak up. When I was talking to Congressman Raul Grijalva's staff about having him come speak to Senate Natural Resources, for example, about the bill. He is the chair of the Congressional House Natural Resources Committee, and is a big environmental justice advocate. And his staff said, are you going to start by having an Indigenous speaker, a migrant farm worker, speak, someone from an impacted community? We want to hear them first before we say anything. And, I think inverting that pyramid is something, that you can all try and commit to before this process is over. And perhaps some of you already have, and that's appreciated.
Thanks so much. Commissioner Attorney June.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, Senator, and thank you so much for joining us today. I have two questions. One is can you help me with my misty memories? And secondly, about other fora that you may be paying attention to. Do I recall correctly that your initial work in the legislature on this was in front of the House Committee on Natural Resources as it existed at the time in 2008, or am I misremembering that?
So, I mean, the bill got introduced before I was a legislator. So my memory is
Okay.
not going to be great on this either. It was my senior thesis, and
Okay.
Rachel Weston, who was a 26-year-old legislator from Burlington, who was
Okay.
on the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee, which I vice chaired when it was still in this. If what you're getting at is before it got broken up into 3 different committees, it was House Natural Resources and Energy in 2007. Before.
Thank you. Thank you. Sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to grab all the reins together and weave them back together to pick up the thread of the discussion in the state of Vermont. So thank you for that. I remember both of you well from that period of time. I was a cub attorney at the department back then. Secondly, in crafting your proposal for this year, have you been looking at all at the conversation that's been happening in the New England region around environmental justice, and specifically the vision statement that was released by the 6 New England governors' representatives to the New England States Committee on Electricity? It's quite a bit of work that we did last year, and environmental justice was a big component of that. Did you have a chance to look at any of that?
I don't think I have. I was nodding because I thought you were talking about environmental justice efforts that are coming more from the grassroots and from legislators in the form of, Renew New England and, those kinds of more, justice oriented spaces. But, I think I would love to see what you're talking about. I think often justice is an afterthought. I would love to look and verify if it's, really embedded in the framework so that nothing can move forward without justice and equity. And I think that's, going to be really critical moving forward, as justice is not nice to have, it's at the center of.
I find that's a challenge in working in this area because, that has been precisely the push, is to not have justice be an afterthought in the regional planning and thinking for the regional grid, and then of course at the respective state levels when it comes to siting and the like. And we had quite a bit of public engagement around this, that was designed and in fact succeeded in eliciting quite a bit of grassroots participation. So it's helpful to close these connections, and I'm happy to look into getting those materials to you. But this is a space that we've been quite active on in front of ISO, in front of the ISO board, in the NEPOOL and the like, to change consciousness. And I have to agree with you. It's a challenge, but I think the will is there. And so it's so important to honor the spirit of movement forward, as opposed to staying in preconceived ideas about who does and who does not care about this issue. I think your piece here is a fantastic piece that is excellent for reset. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sue?
Thank you, Senator, so much for joining us and for your important work. I do want you to know, because you asked, that because the legislation for which we have been formed specifically calls out equity and justice and establishes a subcommittee to focus on that, we have done that. And I want you to know that the majority of the members of that subcommittee are not white privileged people. We tried very hard to recruit and include a diversity of voices, including youth, Indigenous voices, Black and Brown voices, New American voices, and low-income voices. Not that that is an all-inclusive group, but I did want you to know that we worked hard, and I think this subcommittee has worked hard to gain one another's trust and understanding. And then what our charge was to establish what we call guiding principles for a just transition. And actually the council has hired Kaya to help work with the other subcommittees. I want you to know that this is a long way from over. I don't think we can say it is embedded in our framework yet. But I think all of the council members, as they participate in their subcommittees and evaluate and develop their ideas and plans and pathways and strategies and actions, are being forced to think differently. And while not the final objective, I see it as significant. I just also want to let you know that we, on Friday, were asked to testify before the House Committee on Energy and Technology, Representative Briglin's committee. And I would love for you to hear the voices. I did forget to mention labor, the voice of labor. Also in our group, every member who spoke so eloquently and powerfully, I think, did great justice to, I think, the efforts that you are trying to seed. And so I did want you, I'm going to share the link because it's worth a listen. It was beautiful and powerful. And I think a different message than perhaps, certainly different voices than necessarily are often heard. So we're trying. How's that?
Yeah, I think Jane sent that to me, but please do send it again just in case it was something different. So really appreciate that. And, you know, I think as you know so well, Sue, you know, when you invite someone to sit at your table, like they have to at least be able to rearrange the silverware before they eat, you know, so it becomes more of a question of then how much are people hearing the feedback and changing the way that things operate. And that's feedback for the legislature too. We, you know, BNRC and others tried to help us just with a small effort to increase the stipend or per diem available to people who participate in government processes from $50 to $100. And that alone was, you know, too big of a lift for the legislature, unfortunately, given the at least hundreds, I believe, of boards and commissions that exist. But, you know, the wide disparity between who can volunteer their time, because $50 and even $100 is still volunteering your time when so much is asked of this group. That disparity is only growing in the pandemic. And as we come out of the pandemic, you know, people are really stressed and stretched, and, you know, asking people to use their voice without compensation is becoming, I think, harder to do, and something that the legislature has to reckon with as well.
Thanks. Chris, please.
Thanks for joining us today. I have a question, your perspective on the Global Warming Solutions Act itself. I was appointed by the House to represent municipal interests, and my regular job, I'm executive director of Regional Planning Commission. And in my world, it is absolutely critical to adopt and implement policy that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. But it's also critical to develop and implement policy for adaptation and resilience. And in my real world, not a theoretical world, those two things are of equal importance, because while we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the generations to come, for the generations now, we need to protect life, health, and safety, and do so in a way that, you know, a lot of the frontline communities are people who are on the margins. They're the ones who are most likely. And so one of the debates or issues or concerns we've been struggling with as a council is where does adaptation resilience fit? And I understand the fears that if we don't prioritize greenhouse gas reduction, that we're going to continue to have the problems. But, you know, down here in Southeast Vermont, we just had our worst flooding. We just had our wettest summer on record and our worst flooding since Irene, which is awful. We've also got, you know, the other more silent killer we don't talk enough about, which is heat, and who's got access to cool spaces during those heat waves. I just like to get your take on the legislation itself, and do you see any need for change in it, or do you feel like it's satisfactory the way it is? And if you don't have an opinion, that's totally cool too.
I always have an opinion. I'm probably walking into some long-standing fight in this group, you know, but of course, we have to acknowledge that people are already feeling the effects of global warming and climate change. So even calling it the Global Warming Solutions Act as though, you know, it's something that we can solve before, you know, we have problems on our hands is presumptuous and definitely leaves people out of the conversation. As I said, since 2000, we've been getting environmental justice grants, and many of those have been going to communities that have experienced dramatic weather events as, you know, life altering. And so, you know, I think we already, when we traveled the state talking about our environmental justice work, what we heard was a lot of lingering trauma from Tropical Storm Irene, that people never were fully taken care of by their neighbor. You know, we heard all the really lovely stories of, you know, in Waterbury, people who you don't know coming out to muck out your basement and help you get back on your feet. As Sue knows, in Duxbury, where there's a large mobile home contingent, folks felt like they were watching helicopters fly over for days and no one came to get them. And so, we have already a disparity in how we're able to recover and respond to disasters. And if we're not better, at dealing with that now in an unfolding pandemic or in the future, we're going to have a situation where people feel like this Global Warming Solutions Act did nothing for them and didn't really understand their needs and experiences. So, could not agree more. I think there's a lot of urgency even within and coming out of the pandemic. I've talked to Erica Borneman, who I really appreciated. For example, we have this alert system where I know that like a water pipe broke in Richmond, but I don't know, what schools are open or closed or what pandemic information is current. And I also can't get that information easily in other languages. Maybe I can now because I said to Erica, I'm sure that New York City has figured this out and uses the same system, and parts of, California. So there are small but really meaningful things we can do to create emergency response systems and communication webs to increase resiliency is connectivity. So that goes for internet and communications. It also goes for having relationships built. We should have WhatsApp channels that are ready to communicate in various languages to people because that's where they are. They might not even get Everbridge or Life Alert or whatever, Vermont Alert, whatever it's called. They are probably able to access WhatsApp and get clear information that way that they don't have access to otherwise. We passed a bill on expanding the role of cultural liaisons in some of our New American communities. And that's an environmental justice bill because in the pandemic, those folks said, I don't know where my social worker is. They, their cultural liaison was their lifeline, was the person that they just said, there's this person who calls me, tells me everything that's happening. And now it's summertime, the pandemic is raging and I don't know how to reach them. We can't have that in a natural disaster that's more quickly moving. That's a really frightening prospect. And it's taken days to weeks for information to get out in other languages, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. And we have to have learned from that and not repeat that again.
Thanks, Catherine.
I have hundreds of things I want to say and ask about because this is such an intriguing topic, but I'm going to focus on one question, which is, in looking at the bill, I didn't see any mention of the permitting system and incorporating EJ principles into the permitting system. And I'm wondering if that's a future goal or if that's something that's also happening, or just talk about your thoughts on that from a legislative perspective.
Well, I hope this doesn't sound too glib, but I certainly wanted this bill to have good chances. So I didn't put permitting directly in it, because that is a third rail in the legislature. And that conversation has come up. I know that there was a big attempt at talking about Act 250 and permit changes that originated in House Natural Resources. I'm very interested in that conversation from a lot of perspectives and realms. And I really think it's an area where you have to acknowledge that environmental justice and environmentalism probably have two distinct perspectives on what it means to bring transit-oriented, dense housing online, for example. We're not just brown faces who say the same things that white environmentalists do. This is a really different movement. And it's one built around access to quality of life and ecological amenities for everyone. And so, I think permitting is going to be one of those places where putting in an environmental justice lens or an equity lens on that, doesn't mean you build less things. It probably means you make sure that they are more accessible and available to everyone and in proximity to transportation hubs and, other amenities that people need to access, but also recognizing that we hear from seniors, they still need single story or, single family dwellings to access. People of color still want to be in, ecologically beautiful areas. They still want access to nature. So it's not a either or. I hear equity thrown around a lot. If you don't want density, you're racist or you don't believe in, environmental justice. It can really cut both ways. It really has to do with building systems that listen to those most impacted and most marginalized. And as I said, 76% of people of color in Vermont identify as nature deprived. So, we don't want to stick them into urban heat islands, and leave them there just because there's a bus near them. We want to make sure everyone has a park and green space and access to nature and well-being.
Hiya, go ahead, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Senator Rahm. So this is really a comprehensive bill and an important and powerful approach to how we're looking to, not just in this moment, but in the future, look towards the various forms of equity and justice that are necessary to make this a real just transition into a different future. I would be curious, though, because one of the things that might happen within this, and it's going to be important for us to situate the work of this Climate Council in reference to this. Does your bill resolve all the equity issues? Like, if your bill goes through, are we good here? Like, does everything just have to be like we're all happy and that's all that's going to be necessary to bring the procedural and the other components of justice that are necessary to build this out? From your opinion, do you feel like your bill that's the one? I mean, it is the one, but is that the only piece of how we're supposed to look at the work that the Climate Council will do and the CAP moving forward?
If I said yes, someone should pay me a lot more money than I make as a senator. But I'm glad you spelled that out. I mean, absolutely not. I feel like I've been trying for 15 years to get a very foundational early building block in place for conversations to look different, for ANR and other agencies to rethink who is centered in their work and how they engage those folks and do their work, who feels like they're part, who even knows what ANR does, frankly. I mean, when we did those conversations in the state, we would say, can you name all the environmental problems that you experience or see? And people could fill pages and pages and pages. And then we said, who do you go to get these problems addressed? And, to Chris's point, if it was flooding, if it was resilience, it was something like that, I don't know. Maybe the town, maybe my regional planning, maybe the state. I mean, people were almost in tears saying, I know what the problem is. I don't know where I go to get help. And that is where, user experience, democracy building, environmental justice, and public participation all meet. You have to know whether or not people feel like they can even access the services and the levers that you have to pull. And often it's very wealthy and affluent people who can pull the levers in Act 250, can pull the levers in ANR, and other people are completely in the dark about how to even take care of, flooding remediation in their community. So that is, I think, the building block we're trying to create, is that people have a hook to put in to the state government when they have an environmental problem that they need resolved, and that they think of government as a partner in solving it.
Joey, go ahead, please. Hang on, Joey, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Senator. Thank you for being here today and for your years of work and for bringing this as far forward as possible. And I think you really sort of spoke to what I wanted to ask you about, which is, it does seem like a building block, a fundamental building block. Will it solve everything? To Kaya's question, no, but it seems like a very worthy and important framework. And it is my hope, and would it be helpful and for the council we've been hearing from a lot of folks about their interest in an overarching environmental justice policy to sort of serve as that foundational building block. It is my hope, and my question to you is, would it be helpful if we support, whether it's S48 or an environmental justice policy of the state of Vermont more broadly, to help you move this over the line this coming session?
Yes, thank you for the question. I promise folks I did not tee these up or ask folks to do this, but absolutely, it sounds like the Climate Council is moving towards resolution on some issues, has been having this discussion. I'm grateful that I was invited here. And S148, I think, is a really foundational way to support equity as a new and central component to what our ANR and climate efforts look like going forward. The bill would be tremendously well served to have your support. We have talked a lot about what if the bill ends up in different forms, in other, pieces of legislation this year. We all know that that is probably still success. What worries me is that a lot of people worked on the language as it is intact in S148. And so, I would ask you not just to endorse the language and the principles and the idea, but the actual bill, because that is really a way to underpin that you believe in bringing voices to the table who helped write this language, who have not been involved in drafting environmental policy before. So, you know, I hope you will endorse the bill in its current form as introduced in Senate Natural Resources and Energy. There is a House companion bill coming. I have been in touch with House members on some elements where the bill could be improved. So am I saying, you know, the bill is perfect and please don't touch it? No, you know, I'm saying this is getting an important conversation moving, and the bill as drafted is an incredible foundation for improvement and for us to pass, hopefully, this bill by the end of session. Some of you know, that's a tall order, but at least if people know that S-148 is supported going into the session, then a lot of the language will remain intact throughout the process.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Can I follow up, David? Which is just, Senator, can you put a finer point on the funding that Vermont may miss out on if we don't put, you know, certain parameters and policy like this in place? I think that's a really important context for people to, remind us.
Yeah, you know, I can't even begin to explain what, you know, funding I think it's possible to miss out on. I mean, you know, I think Sue, when she was in transportation, probably knows that there was a lot of civil rights and participation compliance that is a huge chunk of our overall budget in the state in transportation. You know, that's a lot of our dollars and infrastructure resources, and they have had an EJ requirement. You know, just as long as the EJ requirement has been in place for decades, we all have this EJ requirement in the state, but funding is, you know, not been predicated on it necessarily in all of our agencies. I see Peter's hand up, and, you know, I do believe the EPA may communicate once again that Vermont needs to have this framework in place within its environmental apparatus to simply comply with, you know, current law. There have been federal laws passed, there have been executive orders, there have been, you know, multiple performance partnership agreements with ANR where equity language and environmental justice principles were supposed to be introduced. What I do want to thank ANR for doing is in that process, reaching out to stakeholders and at least academics in this field in the last few years to make sure that the definition isn't just borrowed from the federal government, that we look around and take what's working, takes what will work for Vermont and our rural context into account to build a definition of justice that makes sense for us. So, you know, we didn't want this to be rushed. I could say that after 15 years, just for the sake of having something on the books, but to make sure that Vermonters are ready for this conversation and feel like when this is passed, it's a new tool in their toolbox to participate in environmental decision-making.
Peter, if you want to offer a last question, and then I think we do need to liberate Senator Rahm Hinsdale, who's gone beyond the time she committed on this.
Yeah, I want to thank Senator Rahm Hinsdale for coming in and talking with us. Obviously, this is an incredibly important topic and one that we could probably talk about for another 2 meetings on and provide sort of status of various activities that are going on in terms of what ANR is working on now to not only come into compliance so that we make sure that we ensure ongoing funding, but to make sure that we're doing it thoughtfully, right? Which was the first feedback that we got was, don't just write an EJ policy, right? Engage with communities, understand what the needs are that are out there so that we can write an informed policy, so that the work that happens is authentic in a way that we often miss the boat on in state government, right? We write something, we get public comment on it, and we assume that that's, you know, sort of check the box. This deserves better, and we're giving it better. And I just want to make sure that this conversation is huge and could take us in a lot of different places. And from a broad perspective, yes, we're all in and working towards these things, but it really it just, to me, I just think it deserves more time than half an hour on the calendar to really do it justice. And I appreciate the fact that we're going to have that conversation in the legislature in a really meaningful way this session on what it means and what the details are and all those things that where the public can really engage. So just wanted to sort of provide that broader view to to the overall work that's going on. So thank you.
Senator, anything else from your perspective that you'd like to share with folks here today?
I mean, always, but as Peter said, this is a topic that's near and dear to me. I will go anywhere to talk about this, that people need to be able to have this conversation. So, happy to stay in conversation with any of you or be invited to other spaces, and especially to hear from people who are impacted. So as you are, doing your work writ large, but also thinking about supporting this and how it might move through the legislature, you hopefully are coming across people who have really compelling stories to tell. And we want to hear those and make sure that's integrated into the bill. So please, stay in touch. I think I'm pretty easy to find. And I just appreciate you all considering your support of the bill as it advances through the legislature. That would be a huge, not only benefit to a bill that I care a lot about, but language that was crafted and drafted and heart and soul was put into it by people who don't often get to call themselves environmentalists or participate in this movement. So I think it's something really exciting happening, and I look forward to continuing to build on that with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You are absolutely welcome to stick around and continue to be part of this conversation. What we're going to pivot into next is talking about how the subcommittees have been applying the just transition principles and rubric in their work. And so we'll do a quick round with the different subcommittees and see how that's going. But thanks again for your time, and take care.
Catch the recording or make Kaya tell me what happened. Thank you all.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Take care. Okay. Great. All right. So why don't we do this? We've got about 20 minutes to do a sort of walk around of what's going on in the subcommittees in this work that Kaya's supporting and everybody in the subcommittee is working on. And before I turn to Kaya, though I really don't have a strong plan on this, but I feel like subcommittee members, if you want to do some reflection, and then I'd love to get Kaya, your feeling about how this is going as well, and really what will be powerful and meaningful in the coming days and weeks, and then also after December 1st. But why don't we do a quick go around with folks in subcommittees? I'm happy to start with co-chairs if you want to react. I know we've got a couple co-chairs on the line right now. Erica, you want to kick us off?
Love to. Every time we have these conversations about the importance of starting out a process from the beginning with justice at the forefront, it just underscores our concern and our ongoing struggle with the time frame that we have to be able to understand the equity impacts of the actions that we're putting forth or that we're charged to put forth in the climate action plan. We had a fantastic discussion on Friday with Kaya, raising up some of the actions that are a little bit more fully fleshed out. And it really highlighted the fact that a number of this assessment, in order to be beneficial and valuable in terms of the implementation of those actions, really needs to be done thoughtfully and with time. And that's not really something that we have the luxury of as it relates to the climate action plan, but it is something that we have an opportunity to take advantage of once we have moved past some of these deadlines around the climate action plan and fully flesh out some of the actions that have risen to the top in our subcommittees. So we're really looking forward to being able to do that with time and thoughtfulness. I'll just put it right out there that really the consensus of our group is that we don't have the time to do that. And in fact, it would be very damaging to do that within the time frame of that we have to submit our information for the climate action plan.
I'm so glad you said that, Erica. I wonder if you could say then, how would you frame what it is, what you all will be lifting up ahead of December 1, right? Sort of for the council to look at, and how would you distinguish that from what you see happening after December 1?
You know, I think we've talked a lot about the pathways and the strategies to carry forward those pathways that have really risen to the top, and our subcommittee feels really, really confident in the impact of those strategies. It's really when you get to the action level and the level of detail that's needed to fully flesh out those actions and prioritize them, where we run into concerns about, you know, how much time we've had to be able to put thought behind the impact of the specific actions. So I think what you're going to see and what we've talked about in terms of revising our input to the climate action plan, you'll see some very strong pathways and strategies. You will see some policy proposals that are high level and straightforward. You will not see a level of detail that that we were hoping to get to, but frankly, this is a wide-ranging sector of climate policy, and one that hasn't had the benefit of focused attention at this level in the state, at least for this period of time. You know, there's a lot of research and a lot of information that we can benefit from, a lot of engagement we can benefit from, and to put anything forward in a climate action plan that doesn't reflect the level of detail that or the level of time and energy that needs to that reflects the value of those proposals would be damaging. And I don't know, Catherine, if you want to add anything to that, but you can always count on me to jump right in. So.
I'm glad you did, Erica. Those of you who participate on our subcommittee know that this has been a real source of discussion at our past several meetings, and we did want to elevate this issue to the council. So I'm glad we have that opportunity. What our committee is able to do is largely what Erica described. And in terms of the equity screen, we don't have the capacity nor the time to do the level of detail that deserves in terms of using the tool. That doesn't mean that we haven't considered these issues, these principles in our work. It just means we don't have the time to fully utilize the tool in time for our draft. As Erica noted, we had a great session with Kaya last week, but it was last week and our draft is due a week from today. So there's just not the time built into things. What we are able to do is our drafters who are working hard will be able to incorporate some discussion of these issues and the principles in our work, but we won't be able to complete the full screen for all of our actions. You know, our committee is very differently resourced than other committees in that we don't have any. You know, we have Marion's time and we have the dedicated time of our subcommittee members, and that's all we have. We don't have consultants. We don't have the support that other subcommittees have had in this work. And that also leads me to think that we've never had a discussion at the council level that I'm aware of how our resources are allocated. And I think we need to have that discussion, both for the resources we still have, as well as the resources we'll be asking for again, because I think if we had had some input in that, some opportunity to discuss that, we may have resourced things a little bit differently. I don't know that we would have. I mean, it's all hindsight at this point. But I think, I don't want to talk anymore, but because we could talk forever about this, but just want to just make sure the council understands that what you'll be getting from our subcommittee in the draft may look a little bit different to reflect the ability of our committee to get to where we need to be.
That's great. And I'd love to hear something similar from or a similar reflection from Ag and Ecosystem, but Jane, you got your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Catherine and Erica for jumping right in. I wanted to, for the sake of the conversation, tease out the two issues that Catherine and Erica are identifying, because I think one warrants a conversation broadly about the application of the scoring rubric and the equity screening, and with Kaya's input on how that's going with the subcommittees and what we can expect for December 1st across all three of the subcommittees, because I actually think it's somewhat consistent across the three subcommittees and actually not as different perhaps for rural resilience as it is for the other subcommittees. And then the second point that I wanted to just put a finer point on is around what the climate action plan might look like with respect to the body of work from rural resilience and ag and ecosystem, and how that folds in, and tie it back to what we had proposed in the CAP drafting process, and how it might differ based on this conversation. And that's a sort of a second conversation that I know we're hoping to just sort of lift up and get clarity around today, which is that we've proposed in the CAP drafting process a consistent approach to how we draft pathways, strategies, and then a consistent table for actions and the components that you're supposed to address for every action, speaking to the foundational criteria, as well as the lead implementer and a timeline. And what I understand from Erica and Catherine, and as well as conversations with Ag and Eco, is perhaps following a more streamlined approach for how actions are carried into the climate action plan that is different now than what we had proposed in the CAP drafting process. So maybe we could table that component of the conversation for the end and focus in on the scoring rubric as well, so that we have consistency with how we're using that and our expectations across all subcommittees.
Thanks, Jane. That's helpful. So other subcommittees, when you're hearing these comments, are you having a similar experience in what's going on and how you're applying these principles and what this means? Peter, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, David. I would say I largely agree. I think that there are two challenges for IC, for a procedural justice standpoint and a distributive justice component. One, the first question that we get asked in the squared rubric is where the individuals or communities affected by these actions consulted in the development of these processes. It pains me to say that with the timeline that we've had, we have not had the chance to do that co-creation process. And it's really hard, or it's been uneven at best. And so it's really hard for me to I will continue to work through the scoring rubric past that question, but it's really hard to get past that question. So there's that component of it. I think the other piece is that there's this chicken and egg situation with the level of detail associated with the policies that we're recommending. If we want to, if most of the policies are high level in nature, and we know the equity considerations, and we kind of advise the legislature on, here's how you need to incorporate, these are the things you need to incorporate to ensure the equity principles are met. But it is to that level of detail rather than saying these specific communities, based on these data that we have in hand, right, these are the impacts. And so I think in some ways it's a honest reflection to the public as to what we are and are not capable of. And I agree with Erica and Catherine in that to do this in a rushed fashion would be way worse. And so I really want to be cautious about how we engage on these topics. And given that, as we've described, December 1st is the beginning of a long conversation, right? That we should not treat it as something where it must be done by that point, because then we'll have missed the boat on both the procedural and the distributive justice aspect of things, from my perspective.
Thanks, Peter. Other reflections about how this process is going? I'd also invite Kaya to weigh in too, obviously. Sue, go ahead, please.
I think that we began this conversation the last time we met, and as I was looking at the summary of our notes, every single one of these issues was discussed. And I continue to believe that we're making significant progress, but that we are in no way able to have any procedural equity. What we did was engage people in thinking about climate, and I think we did a good job with our consultants, but that wasn't about what we're talking about, because we don't have these ideas yet. And so I continue to feel like we should continue to make progress, but that recognize that what we're going to deliver. To me, what I heard from Erica and Catherine seems really appropriate to where we are. I will say that was a lot the message that was delivered to the legislature, to that committee on Friday, and also that they were prepared for that message because they are hearing from their constituents as well. But I don't know what exactly it looks like, but I continue to believe that we are advancing the ball in ways that we've never done before, particularly with respect to resilience and preparedness. And then how do we think about equity in that? And I will also mention that this issue of language has been very loudly raised in our lack of language and access. Because of the lack of language access is a super problem. And I think from a civil rights perspective, per Senator Rahm Hinsdale's perspective, something we are at risk of not meeting. And that there's a real problem there that we need to address. And I know everybody knows that, or I think everyone knows that, but it is something that we heard a lot of in our subcommittee and that the legislature heard about on Friday. But I think they know that this is a first iteration, as we've all described it, and a good step forward, although it is not meeting the bar of having procedural equity baked into where we land, in my view, in December. Sorry, and I see Sarah is here. I know she doesn't have long to be, so I don't know if she wanted to comment as well.
I don't have anything to add, Sue. I think you did nice lifting up. These are ongoing areas of concern in our subcommittee as well. So yeah.
Great. Other reflections, Kaya?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to speak. I know Abby's here on the call, and she's probably tired of having to talk, having to say these things, because she's feeling that in her bones, right? So everything I'm so I want to say, as much as this feels like this is sort of a mixed moment in both the sort of excitement around like we are producing something. There is going to be something that will come out of this whole process, but the recognition that this is not our A game. This is not the level of the quality that we want to be able to produce. What I would want to say, and I want to also acknowledge that's a bit of a heartbreak for a number of y'all, right? As well as for the public, because we do feel on some levels a pressure that there are political mechanisms happening in the background that could make this, like, is this your one pass? Is this your one moment, right? So I've seen and I've felt very clearly from each of you how much you want to bake in this equity and how important it is to try to get this right, right? This does feel like an important point and moment in time. So what I am going to say when I think about where we go from here, move towards on getting your CAP done. I know you need to get that done, and that's sort of a weight that has to be lifted off of you. Do continue to use the scoring rubric and the questions as a guide. In this sense, what you are going to be asking is that the state's going to need to continue this process in order for you to be able to really have these proposals come forth and have the equity baked into it as we expect it to be. This will give you a chance to start to identify what are those things that you're going to need. So as Commissioner Walk was saying, even for example, we don't have that co-creation with the communities. And if we were to even take a shorthand of what came from the community engagement, it was not even in how the responsiveness was, who was participating in that. And there was still pages and pages and pages of written things that came in as well. The summaries that came from Head Start, the summaries that came from 350, the summaries that came from multiple different groups that were out there trying to make this a really rich body of work that you could draw from and say, okay, we are hearing the voices of Vermonters in this. But they still need to see that equity screen once it's done and say, yeah, I think we got it right. That's that final piece. So as you're thinking through what your recommendations and your policy recommendations might be, if you are able to come up with some sort of legislative language, consider making recommendations around effective dates. So we do have our timeline on things that need to be met, but some of the timelines on the effective dates of these may give you more space to do the kind of engagement that's going to be necessary so that you can really feel well in your conscience. And as a state, we know that we will have done something here, right? So we're going to continue to be there, and I'll be there as a guide with you all this week to help hear and reflect on the work that you all have done. And this is not to say that it goes out the window, because I know that some groups were able to get a little bit further in that work where others aren't. But as we've said, some of these are creating worlds that don't exist. And so that does take a bit more time. But there are clear opportunities to do this and do this well. So I am grateful that you're in this. I'm grateful that you're all in this. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. I can tell you that we are going to be looking towards, as I will be not attending the subcommittee meetings past kind of November 1st, but I'll be around. I'm not gone. But I will be looking for some evaluations from you all and an ability to be able to hear what is working for you. What are you hoping to get from this? How can we continue to grow on this type of work, which we are known for being pioneers in this kind of work, and this is what we're going to be doing, right? So this is our chance to really kind of set our own case study for trying to get this done to scale. So I will stop speaking now and give space for others if there are other chairs that do want to speak to this work. But again, I want you to know that we do hear you and we do see you, and we are taking note, and we will have a report at the end that will also help to support raising your voices for the work that's been done in these last several months. So.
Super. Thanks, Kaya. Any other reflections on this? Abby, go ahead, please.
I guess I just would like whatever we're supposed to do moving forward from today. I agree with Catherine and Erica's assessment of sort of where we're at. I mean, our group still has over 100 actions. The idea that any of those could be run through an equity screening. I will say, you know, in Ag and Eco, we do have a more diverse range of voices at our table than we certainly could have, which has assisted in building in equity discussions and components along the entirety of the journey. And so I think some of our pathway strategies and actions reflect that process in what is coming forward there, but I am still certainly not comfortable putting forward a lot of detail on those actions, pretending that we've been able to do that work. I think what's very alive for me in this moment is that my whole subcommittee is very confused. They're very unclear about what they're supposed to be writing, when they're supposed to, even though, and I know that, we've had emails and everything, but I just think there's a fatigue level going on right now, at least in our subcommittee, and people are feeling really overwhelmed by what's being asked of them. And I guess I do feel I need to say again, I'm really disappointed that the proposal from the counselors in July didn't move forward, as I think it might have avoided some of this. I mean, I was never expecting to draft part of the plan, and I think a lot of people weren't, and I just feel like there's a real weight to that. Again, that's just really alive, at least in Ag and Eco right now, just feeling really under-resourced and unclear and unsure. And I think just feeling the pressure of this moment and not really knowing what to do with that, but doing the best that we can. So I guess clear guidance moving forward from here as to however it's supposed to be formatted for us would be really helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. I'm glad you put it out there so clearly. Jane, you had brought up as a sort of related item, this guidance of like specifically how to format this and what the report's going to look like to reflect the spirit of what we're talking about right now. I don't know if it's a good use of the full council's time to go deep into that right now, but it's certainly, I mean, I think, Abby, I'll actually turn to you a little bit. Would it be helpful to have a conversation right now in all of us, or is it helpful to do that afterwards in detail?
The one thought I've had is, no, I mean, I have the guidance. It's just, if we're thinking about accessibility, right? Different people learn different ways. They access information different ways. Some people are visual, some people are auditory, you know, and so particularly when you're dealing with subcommittee members who have never been a part of writing a plan before, I think having a variety of ways that people can access information and having it very streamlined in how they're supposed to go about doing that is really important. And I think navigating the website has been tricky for folks. And I don't know if there could just be like a space on the website that's like, this is the cap as it exists currently. And within that one page, you could access anything regarding the cap as it's either currently being drafted or different documents referencing that. It just feels, it's very disparate. You have to go to a lot of different pages when you're dealing with people like in our subcommittee that are, yeah, it's just, it's a lot to try to do the work to write. And then it's a lot that, you know, when you sit down to try to write, you're needing to go to so many different places to try to find the information to get to where you need to be. So I think anything we can do in the streamlining of that, and I know that, I mean, I'm saying this and we're supposed to have our drafts in by noon on Thursday. So like, that's probably not going to happen, but those are the thoughts I have at the moment, that it's just, it feels inaccessible for our subcommittee in this moment to get that work to the point where it needs to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Right. No, I'm glad you brought it up. And I think I'd welcome additional thoughts on this before we go to our next piece. And I think the message has come out loud and clear about what's possible by December 1st and what's appropriate by December 1st. And the urgency of what that means for what comes after December 1st. So those are important messages that are coming out today loud and clear, and I'm glad they are. In terms of this drafting stuff, Peter and then Jane, you want to finish up?
I just want to offer something for everybody to hold on to as we talk about this sort of ongoing discussion of the impacts and efforts around our action items, that I think at the same time that we're reflecting to the legislature that our work isn't done, that we need to be careful about those things that are statutorily required once the plan is done. And those are typically primarily the deadlines for A&R rulemaking that come after the fact. And those don't slow down because we are still working. And I think it would behoove us to go, you know, to speak in a unified voice that says, you know, give us the time and space to do this, and the timeline that comes after should reflect the time necessary to do that thoughtfully. And obviously that deserves more discussion, but those are related items in my mind, because that's the tension that we feel in the agency.
Thanks, Peter. Jane?
Yeah. Okay. A couple of things to respond to. First, I do want to own and respect that as the CAP drafting process has gotten underway, that the process that is being used right now and supported by subcommittees and counselors drafting components was what was requested in the proposal that was put forward by the counselors over the summer. I think we as an agency have shifted to more ownership of drafting and writing coming out of subcommittees and with counselors in response to the proposal that was put forward to the steering committee and council ultimately. And so that burden and weight could have been shifted to staff And we were responding to the request of counselors for ownership in the subcommittee and that regard, to not take writing away from folks where the ideas were being generated. So I just felt like I needed to respond to that, because state staff were teed up to support more writing than we're doing. And that was in response to, I feel like, the council asking that of us, to keep writing with counselors and subcommittees, so that staff weren't drafting the work of subcommittees. And so I just felt like I needed to respond to that, because I do think that is a tension, and I feel like that burden right now at subcommittee levels. But there are state staff within subcommittees who I know are supporting subcommittee members as well as counselors to get those first drafts there, and we can certainly support more where and resources are needed in the coming days. And so as far as clarity around the process, I do think the CAP drafting process is really clear around specificity, as well as the website. I'm more than happy, and Marian offered, actually, I think at 2 council meetings ago, to set up a training so folks can see how to use the website, because there is one slick way where you just sort all climate action plan documents, and you don't have to be sorting from different meetings to see every draft and every component of it aligned in one place on the resource page. So if folks, I know it's 11th hour now, but we are more than happy to support individuals in understanding how to use the website. And as far as the process, this is coming late in the game, but we're more than, as I said, happy to support a new approach for rural resilience in ag and eco in the drafting of actions if the specificity can't be brought to bear right now, and focus really on the implementation of how we take that work to the next level after December 1st. And so that's something that we can talk about offline if the council doesn't want to dive in deep on the actual formatting of those 2 subcommittees' work. But I think that as long as there's an appreciation and understanding that the work is at a different place for those 2 subcommittees for various reasons, then we can have the freedom to work to improve upon the draft. And as I think we just want to have the work coming forward in a consistent fashion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jane. All right. So we've put out some clear messages about where we are and what we think is appropriate and correct for our work from here to December 1, and what we think is needed from December 1 and on, having a really strong equity component to it, and some frank language and some transparency to the public as well about what's possible. And that's going to have some implications in the writing, perhaps. And as Peter says, it may have some implications if this council wants to weigh in on the question of rulemaking on the back end of this. Unless someone has another comment or view on this, I suggest we switch gears into the content that we have teed up for today. And I see 2 more hands, so why don't we take those hands and then we'll switch into the content. Sue, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not sure I have a sense of clarity with respect to what we feel we can deliver and what I heard the commissioner describe as possible responsibility under the Act. And I don't know if there's a gap there that we need to address. So I don't think we can do that today, but I definitely think we need to know if there are things we must deliver that we aren't feeling can receive the level of equity assessment and engagement that is needed to meet our bar, but might need to be done anyway, perhaps with some caveat or statement to that effect in order to meet what is required of us by law. That's the piece I don't know. I don't have vision on, and maybe we should consider next week.
Great. Thanks,
If I
Sue.
could jump in quickly, I think I may be able to explain it very succinctly in terms of ag and ecosystems and rural resilience. It's simply the construct that we placed on ourselves in terms of the content and structure of the CAP. For the other subcommittees, there's an action table that has a lot of details in it that will be used to describe each action. For the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, we won't be using that table and filling out that level of detail. We'll be listing our actions under each strategy and pathway instead. So the actions will be there. They'll just have a lot less detail. And I think that's also beneficial to approach the CAP that way, in that, Abby mentioned the large number of priority actions they have. We have a similar number. If we were to use that space, we would overwhelm the CAP in terms of the page contents versus the mitigation strategies, which are the ones that do have the statutory requirements. So that's my quick summary, and I hope that helps.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah. Abby?
I'm sorry. I have to push back a little bit on what Jane offered. The proposal, as I understood it, was that's inaccurate. The proposal that was put forward by counselors was that counselors who had capacity and volunteered themselves to write would be able to do so because they had plan writing experience. And this has been part of the problem. And I just really struggle to hear that kind of pushback when I'm doing everything that I can to try to keep up with all of the work that we have. And I was just trying to speak a bit of my truth in that. And I just want to put that out there, that it was my understanding from Dr. Dupini-Giroux, Chris Campany, and Lauren Oates that the proposal was that counselors who had capacity and plan writing experience would assemble a group, and that the plan would be co-created with staff and those counselors to be brought forward. I just feel like I need to set the record straight a little bit on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. I appreciate that. Liz?
I was going to hold off because Jane had said at some point that we were going to talk about the action table later, but it's come up so much. I'm wondering if we could just finish that conversation, and specifically, at least I'll speak on my behalf only, but I would be surprised if at least some of the cross-sector committee wasn't feeling similarly. I'm not sure the action table, I don't know that it's a perfect fit for our subcommittee either. And so as we're going through the draft, it would be really helpful to understand whether there's a level of consistency that could be done more broadly. I mean, just as an example, when we're talking about measures to bring improvements to homes and buildings to allow for fuel switching, including electrification, and we've had a lot of conversations about how to do that. But it's a classic example of the devil in the details in terms of, to whom, at what level, in what order, and all of the equity discussions that we've had apply really, really strongly in that one particular, I'm just using that one as an example. And, I would challenge the notion that our subcommittees had a chance either in the weatherization for all or the electrification side to really go through that in the level of detail we'd want either. So maybe we can finish that conversation now, or I just don't want to have it hanging that it's inapplicable to other committees when, at least in my view, it doesn't feel that way.
Right. And Liz, so I'm understanding what you're saying is from a cross-sector standpoint as well, the level of detail from that table or that proposed table is beyond the level of detail that you think is right. Number one.
It's actually two problems in my view from trying to write. One is that it's almost like the organization of the table and the categories both risks giving short shrift to the actual discussion that we've had, and could falsely leave the impression that we've gotten further than we have. Like, I kept wanting, instead of filling out a table with short answers, to be able to say, we've talked about that, and the things that need to be addressed are X, Y, Z. And there's a range of, answers there. It's like, it's just not, it's both too much and not enough at the same time.
Really interesting. Thanks for that. I'm not sure we're going to resolve that right now, but I think everyone's saying it loud and clear, and that's important. I don't know if there's any other comment about that. We do have other things we need to get to today as well. Chris?
I mean, quickly, does it make sense that we all do it the same? I mean, I would like to see the plan have consistency. across the board. And I think it would make for a shorter and more concise plan if we just listed our actions in each of our subgroups.
Okay. So at the risk of letting this go deeper, I will say, for those who are most involved in writing right now, what Chris and Liz and others are putting out there, does that make sense as a pathway for getting this on the page for the initial climate action plan December 1st?
Does what make sense, David? Does this?
Sorry, to backing away from a detailed table. And again, I'm probably not the right one to be doing this because I'm not in the mix on the writing right now, but backing away from a detailed table has been put out in a template in more of a list of actions in a discussion about the issues. I think that's what Liz is trying to say and others, right? Or what Catherine said there, you're planning on doing in rural resilience. Jane?
I guess I would love to hear cross-sector, in addition to Liz, speak to this, because I have seen substantive drafts already done in this format for cross-sector. And so I just worry about asking folks who have already done it to pivot now.
To go backward, right? I hear you.
Mm-hmm.
So. I guess I would jump in and say there is no perfect format. And I think that as a visual learner, our plan has the tendency to move towards lots of words, and that's tough to digest. And I do think that the tables offer the ability to take out a sort of a bite-sized chunk of something. It's not going to be sufficient. It's not going to be perfect, but to me, it's better than just straight verbiage, because I think what happens when we get into straight verbiage, we end up in a situation where we want to make sure we say everything, and we say more than is necessary to communicate in the. So it just, I like it. It forces us into a relatively brief statement of what our idea is, knowing that much more work will follow as we go forward.
Can I make kind of a strong suggestion here, which is I think we should not continue to talk about this as a council right now, and this kind of decision around some formatting and how this all works out. Perhaps Jane can help organize in a small group of folks who are doing that. I just think this may not be the best use of all of our time as a council right now. And we've definitely laid out some ideas and some criteria around this. I see other hands up there, but I will ask if folks are willing to cut off the conversation here, I would love to do that. And if folks feel like they need to say more about it, well, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, right, Gina, so your drafts are due tomorrow, fair enough. Okay, so Gina, is there something that you want to put out there right now, given that you're taking a role in this?
Yes, I've spent a lot of hours in the last few days staring at those spreadsheets and tables, and I don't think we're doing service to the public that's going to have to look at that stuff. It's very confusing, and we are running into a problem of things that weren't very clearly articulated in the first table are ending up getting dropped because they aren't there, and now we believe they need to be there. I would so much prefer to write 2 pages of framing and then a very well, concise, organized narrative about what those actions are, more than bullet points, but not pages and pages, well written and concise, as opposed to these the tables are redundant. You say the same thing over and over again. It just takes up a lot of space. And I think you lose the meaning of what we're trying to say. And this is just coming off my hours that I've spent on this in the last 2 or 3 days. And now given transportation is a lot more complicated. We have a ton of stuff because we're 40% of the problem. It's not working for me. And we do have great help from DEC. Don't get me wrong. V-Trans has not been involved. I wish they were. Anyhow, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks.
And even with a due tomorrow, I just think the public deserves better. The ones who have to digest it at the end.
Yeah. Okay. Leslie Ann, go ahead, please.
So I just wanted to lift up all of the voices that have expressed a lot of concern and angst and everything else that we're dealing with. This has been particularly challenging, particularly an honest conversation. I just wanted to honor that. I just wanted to honor all of my fellow counselors who have spoken up and say that this is perhaps one of the key conversations that we needed to have. And so we're moving in the right direction, but it will take time. And I just wanted to offer that word of hope that we will get somewhere. It may not be where we want to be, but I really, really value all of the opinions and concerns and all of the angst that has really been lifted up today. So thank you all.
So glad you said that. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie Ann. That was really the right tonic. Okay. All right. So we have some steps to make. We did not make a decision on that. It feels like there's some work that needs to happen looking at those who are drafting to make those decisions. I know some are under the gun more than others because of due dates for cross-sector that's like literally tomorrow. I would encourage folks to find a way to have that conversation after today's meeting tomorrow morning. And Jane, perhaps you can be instrumental in pushing those conversations forward. Okay, great. All right. So we have some substantive things as well, in addition to our process, that we need to work on today. And I think, why don't we dive right in, although I am looking at, we've been going for a while, it's tempting to take a break and then dive in. I think it's worth taking a break and coming back after 10 minutes, and then we can dive into our substance. Secretary Young?
I would support going to break now, and I would also add to that, I need a break, but we're behind. We've got a number of action items that are dependent upon folks having read the materials, and there really are generally brief materials. And it would be great to go into the meeting after the break without having to have extensive presentations of the materials, and maybe just ask questions. So that might speed things along.
Great idea. Thanks, Secretary Young. So it's 3:10 now. Why don't we come back at 3:20 and we'll dive into these pieces of content that are on our agenda. We'll see you at 3:20. Thank you, everybody. And I'm not going to try to repeat Leslie Ann's comments because those were exactly, felt like they're hitting the right tone. So thanks, everybody. And we'll see you back here at 3:20. Maybe shorten up. Thanks for starting the recording again. So as we get into this next sections of substance, one way we can tighten up our timing a little bit is if we make reference to the documents that are shared and do tight presentations and then really focus in on questions, comments. For most of these issues, we're going to look to get council approval of the recommendation. So we'll be taking the temperature and we'll be doing those things we've done in the past in the chat of how we're feeling about this. So we'll be doing that to see if the council is comfortable with the recommendations as they're presented or if there needs to be some modifications. So the first one we're going to do is on carbon budget. And I believe, Ryan, you're going to lead off on that, and you may have help from a colleague as well. So Ryan, Patch, why don't I turn it over to you? And if you're going to be doing that by yourself or with someone else.
Thanks. Dr. Kasiba is going to kick off the carbon budget report out, and I'll share some recommendations from we've put together based on that report. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. So Dr. Kasiba, are you here? Great. Excellent.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Just sharing my screen here. Can everyone see that?
Yep. It's not in actual presenter mode. Oh, there it goes. Now it is.
No. Yes. Oh, it isn't. Okay.
No, it is.
Maybe
it
a little
is.
lag.
It
All
is.
right. Great.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Because of time, I'm going to be a little brief here, but we will be posting this online. So my name is Alex Siba. I am work for the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, and here to talk about the Vermont carbon budget that was recently conducted. I was an author of the budget, but also I support the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee for Forest Science Information. And I'm here with Ryan Patch, and we also had help from Judson Peck, both from AAFM. And Ryan will be speaking at the end, but I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Like I said, we're sort of limited in time. I'll post the link to the carbon budget, but we're really here to talk about our recommendations from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee on next steps for the carbon budget. So not get too much into the details about the carbon budget, though we're happy to answer questions as we're here. So just, really brief background on the carbon budget. It's really supposed to be comprehensive, high level picture of stocks and fluxes here. So it's not the same as the greenhouse gas inventory. And it's the first time we've ever done this as a state. So recognizing the importance and role of doing it for the first time, that it will be something we'll need to build off of. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. Like I said, I'll post this online so you can look at it, sort of give some background on the carbon budget. And really, we saw this as a communication tool as well. So there was some talk about how to illustrate different parts of the climate action plan. And this is one of them that is a really great communication tool to talk about the power of our lands and helps us with defining what we mean by net zero by 2050. And I won't get into that too much, but that's a conversation we can have. What is included in that net? And this shows what's included. We call it in the ag, forestry, and other land use sectors. And this is the final carbon budget. So again, I'll direct you to the web if you want to dive into these numbers, but that's sort of not the point of our being here today. Again, another graph from the carbon budget that you can look at that captures some of those values that were computed. And we also outlined some of the limitations in the carbon budget, right? This is a version 1.0. There's some issues with where data sources come from that we can improve upon. There's uncertainties, some issues with time lag. But what we also wanted to portray in this carbon budget is an evaluation of what is or isn't included, and is that comprehensive? Also, is there double counting? And so there can be situations where sometimes you have values that are counted twice or not counted at all, depending on how you do that accounting. But I'm going to pass it over here. That was very brief, but I'm going to pass it over here for Ryan to sort of discuss some of our recommendations for next steps. And like I said, I'll post this online. Ryan and I also presented this last week to the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee if you want to hear a more detailed presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Ali. And the recommendations that Ag and Eco is putting forward, one of them should be very familiar to the Climate Council, which is re-emphasizing and asking for the support, which was already granted on the 12th of October for that additional RFP to look at the ag, forestry, and other land use sector greenhouse gas emissions protocol. Saw a presentation about how greenhouse gas emissions are looked at through the SIT tool, the carbon budget, and the modeling and research that was done for this report helps to lend additional support and justification and need for conducting further research to better understand how to quantify emissions and sinks from the ag, forestry, and other land use sector. So the first three recommendations, sub-recommendations you'll see under this are just examples of what was brought up with the Climate Council before. That could be and feel should be part of an RFP for this sort of research. And then two new ones that have come out as a result of looking specifically at the carbon budget are seen in D and E, which is looking for better research data sets that can better track and report land use change. And then also a review of the cost and feasibility to support some remote sensing technologies for utilization by the carbon inventory to really get a better understanding of land use change throughout the state and try to standardize where information is drawn from so that the carbon budget is comparing apples to apples between the different sectors as an example. Following and in addition to that recommendation is the thought that this is a very important and useful piece of work for not just the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, but also for the Climate Council. And so establishing a periodic and consistent carbon inventory and forecast for Vermont and the ag, forestry, and other land use sector as another recommendation that the subcommittee has for the Climate Council to consider. And as Ali said, happy to answer questions. There's a summary memo which provides some scoping, and the report is pretty detailed, and there's a lot of good information embedded in that. Thanks.
Great. So Ali and Ryan, if I'm to understand this correctly, this is the summary of the recommendations that are related to carbon inventory and carbon budget that are being put forward for the council to say, yeah, please move ahead in this direction. Is that correct?
Yes. The first recommendation is kind of elevating one that was already brought on and discussed and saying, yep, this also is supported by the results of the carbon budget report. And then also the suggestion that this inventory, this budget is an important exercise to engage in the future, as it really helps pull together a good picture of what's happening in the ag, forestry, and other land use sector.
Super, thanks. So councilors, any questions, in particular, any concerns that you would have in what's being put forward here around the carbon budget? Any things that you're not quite sure about or you feel uncomfortable about endorsing as a council? Catherine?
First, I'll just say that stocks and fluxes are a great example of words we shouldn't use when we're talking about these things, even though I'm a member of the Climate Council, though that is not in my vocabulary. And so it took me a while to read through the report and really understand what we were talking about here. But I did read the report and I'm trying to understand, maybe you could just clarify how these two recommendations that are here relate to the memo that we got last night. That was much longer and had a lot more detail. Is this a summary of those? Is this in lieu of those? What, can you just give me some context?
Sure. The memo, the recommendations provide more detail. I would suggest these are the summarized points of those two recommendations, which is research into quantification models for the modeling estimation of emissions and sinks within the sector is important research that should be undertaken, and that a carbon budget or carbon inventory and a periodic and consistent updating to that is important for the Climate Council to continue into the future.
Okay. Thanks, Ryan. There's some activity in the chat just to call your attention around language. One from Secretary Young just asking for in future iterations to talk about a definition for carbon sink, and Jared saying just careful with the language around inventory versus carbon budget, and making sure we're meaning those things the way we mean to mean them. So I don't know if there's anything to say about that, Ali or Ryan, but I'll just flag that's going on in the chat. Okay, great. Are there any concerns counselors have before saying, yes, we are pulling this analysis into and making it ours, and we are comfortable with these recommendations? Any other concerns? Secretary Young? If you're trying to speak, Secretary Young, you're on mute. We still can't hear you, Secretary Young.
Perhaps we should stop sharing screen.
Yeah. So Secretary Young, if you're trying to speak for whatever reason, it's, there we go.
Yeah, no, I'm trying. It's really, I think everyone's having a real capacity issue here with the Wi-Fi today. So I got 3 different mics going. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would just for clarity, when you say me, take this on or take this in, I can't remember the term you used, fumbling with the mics, but my understanding is the carbon budget would appear as an appendix in the climate action plan.
That's a better question for Jane. I'm not quite sure exactly how it physically is attached.
Yeah.
You know.
And so yeah, go ahead. The conversation we would have today would be to have the carbon budget as an appendix and then have the recommendations adopted into the plan. That just for clarity, so folks know what we're doing. I may have it wrong.
Jane, could you just, any additional clarity there? That'd be super helpful. Wait, you're still on mute. You're still on mute.
Not dissimilar. Secretary Young characterized it correctly. It's not dissimilar from the greenhouse gas inventory and social cost of carbon, which you'll see later today as we discuss, where the reports are actually appendices, but there is a summary, and the recommendations around further advancing any work in that space are included in the CAP.
Thanks. Great. June, go ahead, please.
So, David, your question was whether there are any other concerns. So forgive me if this is off base, but I don't have a concern. Instead, I wanted to offer a commendation. I thought the work was very well done, very well captured. And I just want to be clear with the group that I have no reservation about including this in the report, because I'm comfortable relying on the considerable work that the subcommittee did in producing the document. And as counselors, we're going to need to develop that comfort level. So I'm trying to go first here and show by example that I have confidence in the work that the subcommittee did. And I was very pleasantly surprised, and I don't mean that in any way but the best way, when I reviewed this document and the other materials that were given to us for review today. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thanks. I'm glad you said that. Okay. As kind of a habit, when we're actually adopting something as a council, like what we're doing today, because we are going to adopt this carbon budget report, put it as an appendix, as Jane said, and these recommendations would be woven into the CAP recommendations. I think we're going to use a habit here in the chat of, and this is more of a temperature check and just making sure we're okay walking forward with this. And so I would invite counselors to look at the chat for a second, and you put in 1, 2, 3 to say, yep, I support these, or I like them, I support them. I have some concerns, I can live with them, or 3, I can't live with them as written, the recommendations in the report that will go into the index. So I invite all counselors to go ahead and just drop a 1, 2, or 3 in the chat, just so everybody gets a chance to weigh in there for a second. And thanks for everyone who's dropped from the counselors who are dropping that in the chat right now. That's really helpful. Okay. Feel free to weigh in. And what I'll just note is I'm not seeing any threes right now. Okay. So if you were a 3, this would be a really good time to drop it in, because we're going to end this up and move on to the next thing.
David, if it's okay while we're waiting for that, I just want to offer the reason for my 0.5. I just want to reiterate the appreciation and the good work that's gone into this. I do think that one of the things that we learned throughout this process, where there was one committee, the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, that was focused on the carbon budget, and another committee, the Science and Data Subcommittee, that was focused on the greenhouse gas inventory, that there are issues that kind of cross both, and it's important for our communication and collaboration. And while we started talking about this at the last full council meeting, it didn't ever kind of fully come to conclusion in terms of the next step on that RFP, which is the first bullet point recommendation, which I think is a great one. And I would just say that I do think it is important to make sure that we have kind of good communication and collaboration going forward, that there are folks from both subcommittees involved in that process going forward. That's all I wanted to make sure to flag.
Thank you for flagging that. That's great. Okay, so folks, as you can see in the chat, we're not seeing concerns that are going to slow us down here. A lot of support. Thanks. Thanks to Allie and Ryan for putting that. And so with that, let's as a council say, yes, we're going to adopt these, put them as an annex, and take these recommendations on in our CAP. Okay. Great. Thank you, folks. That's wonderful. Let's move on to the next piece, which is on sector proportionality. And I believe, Peter, that's you and Jared that's going to be leading us off in that conversation of what this is all about. So I'll turn it over to however the two of you want to do that.
Yeah, I'll tee up Jared. Jared's done the bulk of the thinking around this in a small group that got together and some thinking stuff beforehand. But this is a follow-up to a conversation we had, I believe, last week. Time is a strange concept these days. Around how do we look at the sort of the one of the 8 requirements in developing ideas that says that we should seek ideas that that from each sector sort of as to their proportion of the share of emissions. Well, what that means matters in terms of how we seek those emissions, how rigid we take that approach, all of those things. And those things aren't necessarily clear in the statute. And one of the ideas that we discussed last week was the idea of bringing to you a proposal might have been the week before actually, bringing to you a proposal that would look at those items and see what you thought. We ran those by the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee as a sort of concept, and bring them to you now for your feedback and input. But this would sort of stand in to say, in the absence of legislative clarification, this is how you, the council, would choose to interpret that direction from the legislature. Without further ado, I will hand it to Jared.
Thanks, Peter. I imagine we all have lots of things to review. I'm hoping folks had a chance to review the memo beforehand and would mostly want to spend this time with any questions that folks might have about it. But recognizing that some folks may not have been able to do that in depth, it's fairly short. So I might just offer a little bit more detail before we jump in and put it up on the screen for everybody to see. And so, here is the memo. Most of the first page is referencing the specific section of the Global Warming Solutions Act, 10 VSA 592D, that speaks to 8 different objectives that the climate action plan should further. The first question we deal with is number 2 here, about in terms of reflecting the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions. What is our reference point for assessing that relative contribution, or as we've often talked about it, the kind of proportional share of emissions from each emitting sector? And then there is another question beyond specifically related to number 2 here, is how do we treat these 8 different objectives in relation to each other, especially when and if they may be not fully aligned, or there may be situations where we can meet some objectives, but less so others, or they're in conflict. And so the first question on that objective number 2 is what we know already what the baseline years are. The legislation sets them out very clearly. For our 2025 targets, it's a 2005 emissions, gross emissions baseline. For our 2030 emissions reduction requirements, and that is a 1990 gross emissions baseline. And the same is true for 2050. The question, though, is what year should we use to assign kind of proportionality by sector? And there were a number of reasons that we thought it was most appropriate to use the most recent data that's available, which comes from 2018 as published earlier this year in the Vermont Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory, published by DEC and ANR. One of the reasons is for that is, starting with the reference point of where we are now, rather than going back in time to a very different set of circumstances. Another is that if you were to use, a date from 15 or 30 years ago, in terms of which sectors were emitting what, and applied that going forward, there could be an interpretation where some sectors would actually be allowed to increase their emissions from where they are now, or from when the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed, which we did not think kind of stood up to the test of we're all in this together. Every sector should be aiming to do its part. And if we choose 2018, again, the most recent available data, then that ensures that no sector would be able to increase its emissions from those levels. We included this table so you can see the references of which sectors were at what share of our total statewide gross emissions in different years. And so another consideration was that a number of the actors in those sectors didn't know in those prior years, 1990 or 2005, that they may be in the future measured against sectoral emissions from those baselines. So for instance, the first greenhouse gas reduction goals weren't passed by the legislature until 2007, and we didn't have binding requirements until the passage of the Solutions Act. And then, so that's question number 1. Question number 2 is about how to interpret that second objective around kind of proportional shares of responsibility alongside other objectives. And we recognize that it's certainly possible that you could, for instance, some sectors may not have cost-effective, technologically feasible, or equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction pathways to the same degree that other sectors do. And for instance, that's just one example of a time in which we would want to use our best judgment to weigh these different objectives with each other, and recognize that we have to use our best judgment as a council if and when those objectives are in conflict, and that we think it's appropriate that when the weight of some objectives kind of outweigh others, to interpret things such that it may be appropriate for some sectors to come in under a very kind of rigid or dogmatic sense of their proportional share if they don't have the same opportunities available to them in terms of cost-effective, equitable, or technologically feasible reductions, or related to some of the other objectives that are listed here, 1 through 8, in terms of supporting economic sectors and regions of the state that face the greatest barriers, especially rural and economically distressed regions and industries, for instance. So hopefully that is a good, thorough overview and not too thorough, but I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions or comments and catch up on the chat.
Great. Luckily, the chat has been quiet so far, and but I think this is a great opportunity to have a quick conversation about this. When you read this document and you hear Jared, Peter talk about it now, is this feeling appropriate? I also want to just be really clear, Jared and Peter, the purpose of this memo is exactly what? Like, how does this fit into the cap? I think I'm channeling Secretary Young a little bit here. So how concretely is this, the council going to use this?
I'll take an initial effort of responding to that, and then Peter, if you want to add. I think one thing is that it really matters for our modeling exercises in terms of what share of responsibility we assign to each sector in our baseline modeling. For instance, when EAN did the initial emissions reduction pathways, we had to choose which reference year to assign sectors, and we chose 2018. So, I think it does end up being important in terms of what gets presented for the LEAP modeling, and the other kind of consultant deliverables from CADMIS and EFG, making sure that we have clarity and alignment on that reference year for the sectors. Not that it's kind of set in stone because of that second recommendation, that's just one of the 8 objectives, but as a kind of consistent, clear reference point.
Okay, so it influences the modeling, which influences how we feel different sectors are doing their appropriate.
It may also affect kind of our measurement and assessment kind of going forward in terms of compliance with the law and tracking what's happening in what sectors, and just having a reference point for kind of which sectors are kind of above or below that reference point.
Great.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think it then goes beyond the modeling. It flows into the specific policies, right? So if we take the clean heat standard as an example, to define what the performance expectations are for the clean heat standard, you need to know what the expectations are within that sector. And
right.
So ergo, you sort of need to have had that conversation and work that piece through. So.
Okay. Great. And also finally, is this memo going to show up somewhere in the cap, or is this just a guidance memo for us as a council, for you as a council?
I think it needs a proactive statement in the cap that said this is the basis for how we considered that component of the cap drafting process that's in statute.
Great. Okay. With that background, any input, questions, concerns, particularly concerns that would stand in the way of you saying, yep, this makes a ton of sense, let's do this as a council as laid out in this memo? Feedback for Peter and Jared on this. Okay. Well, why don't we do the 1, 2, 3 again? I'd be interested in doing that 1, 2, 3, just sort of test where people are at. And so feel free to do that again in the chat. This is the 1, 2, 3. I support the memo as described in the way that Peter and Jared are saying it will be used. Few concerns about it, but I can live with it, or I can't live with this memo and what it's and how it will impact our work. Thanks for those of you who are doing this in the chat. I'm looking attentively at the chat. Okay. I imagine you're observing the same thing I'm observing in the chat. This is a great time to either say, I need more time, or to drop that 3 in if this is a 3 kind of issue for you. Okay. All right, so not seeing those concerns that stand in the way of you saying, let's adopt this and go forward. I'm going to treat this that you are adopting this and as a pathway for you. And thanks for everyone who are dropping their views in the chat. Before I close this up, any final comments from anyone, whether it's Peter or Jared or counselors, on this issue of proportionality before we move on to the next thing?
No, thanks everyone.
Great. Thank you, Jared and Peter, for laying that out clearly. Okay, the next piece for us is on cost of carbon and the social cost of carbon. This is not the first time we've seen this. This is the second time the council has had a conversation on this. And TJ Poor is here to come back and present this new round. And so TJ, let me turn it over to you to walk us through what's happened since the last time we spoke and what it is you're asking the council to sign off on. Now, I believe we have actual text language that folks have been looking at in the last few days that have been posted. But TJ, let me turn it over to you to walk us through what's going on here.
Great. Thanks, David. So August 23rd, I looked at the date. It seems like ages ago, but that's when the council heard about the social cost of carbon and the review of the department's cost of carbon model. Got into detail there. The Science and Data Committee had several recommendations, and really the task that was assigned to the Science and Data Committee that you're hearing about now is to summarize the activities of the committee and the council surrounding these issues and the recommendations. And so the text that was drafted and circulated and as part of the agenda is actually draft text to go into the climate action plan. And that text is really based on the recommendations that were made. But I'll just give a little reminder of where we were. So that in that August meeting, the Science and Data Committee identified the need for economic analysis of climate action plans and mitigation scenarios to account for avoided emissions. And the Science and Data Committee included the review of a social cost of carbon and the department's cost of carbon model, which is really a cost effectiveness analysis, dollar per ton of carbon dioxide saved, in the scope of work for the technical consultants. EFG as a subcontractor to Cadmus was the lead on this. So they produced a report that covered and made recommendations, and the Science and Data Committee adopted those recommendations. And I'll kind of go through those briefly here. As I do this, I guess I should ask David or Jane, should I be pulling the document up on the screen? I thought I heard that you didn't want to do that now, but.
I think a text document is not great to share.
Okay, I won't do it. That's fine.
Yeah.
So I just, as I said, we adopted the recommendations of the technical consultant, and that was to start that the social cost of carbon be adopted, valuing the present value of future damages caused by greenhouse gas emissions, or equivalently the benefits of reducing carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions by the same amount in the year. So that we actually value the avoidance of the emissions that our mitigation strategies will achieve. So I think a lot of the discussion in August was around this next piece, is that the Science and Data Committee also recommended that the council adopt the recommendation to use values developed with a 2% discount rate. So as a reminder, the discount rate's really just a method to place a present value on costs and benefits that happen on a future date. And it's a really key variable and key input in the calculation of a social cost of carbon. And so it's kind of a big deal on how you value those future costs, because we're talking about future damages that go out many, many decades. And so Energy Futures Group did a literature review, found a range of values that have been used in other jurisdictions, ranging from really low numbers to really high numbers, like 7% in the previous federal administration. And so after some time educating the committee on the discount rates, EFG polled the subcommittee, and the results were consistent with the use of a 2% discount rate. I should also note that one of the core pieces that the consultant referred to was recently published guidance in New York State on the social cost of carbon. And New York also recommended the use of a 2% discount rate, but also to look at a range of values from 1% to 3%. I apologize for going into the weeds here, but I think it's really important in understanding not only the discount rate, but also the resulting values in the social cost of carbon. The committee recommended the use of a 2% discount rate after the polling, after the literature review, and after the technical consultant's review and recommendation are consistent with that recommendation. And but we also recommended two other things, that the council plan for updating the cost of carbon and a discount rate on a regular basis as new research becomes available. For instance, the federal government is going to update the social cost of carbon, I believe, in this winter. And so that'll be really relevant to kind of future iterations and continuing to kind of stay relevant. And then also that the committee recommended that sensitivities to the modeling be done to show outcomes on the range of discount rates. So we're recommending 2% be a central rate be used, but also in the modeling of economic impact to show the range at 1% and at 3%. That sensitivity in the modeling, to my knowledge anyway, hasn't yet been run. And then I was looking back at the minutes. I actually wasn't at the August meeting, unfortunately, but I was looking at the minutes, and I just wanted to point out that it looks like the council agreed to advance the analysis with a 2% discount rate while also further reviewing materials and considering additional sensitivity analysis. So that's really where it landed last time, and I just wanted to full circle remind folks of that. I think why don't I stop there and then and get questions there, and then I'll come back on the cost of carbon model separately. I think that part will be brief.
Thanks, TJ. That's great. And I think there's two things to do here. One is if there's recommendations about improving the text that folks have that are important recommendations you want to lift up, let's do that. The second thing is just to confirm that like the big ticket items here, what TJ is putting out there, the discount rate, the further, the language around the recommendations, that everybody's on board with that. So those are two kinds of things. One is like improving the text if you have some ideas. The other is making sure we're really on board with this core content in it. So with that, Secretary Young, go ahead, please.
So is the text the 4-page?
It's what's linked in the agenda. Yeah.
Right. I think it's 3.
It's 2.5, 3 pages. Yeah.
The table, TJ, maybe you're going to address this. Is that in dollars, hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars? The value of damages?
Their value of damages in dollar per metric ton of carbon dioxide. And that's, it's up in the heading of the table.
Great. Is there anything else, Secretary Young, you wanted to mention on that? Okay, great. Okay. Other questions or reactions to what TJ's put out there so far around social cost of carbon and what's in this draft text? And this is draft text that goes right in your cap. Anything folks want to flag up for TJ reactions?
Catherine has something in the chat.
Okay. Don't see the sensitivity analysis recommendation included in the text.
Yeah, that I think you're right, Catherine, and that I think that can be added. I think that I talked about that after reminding myself of what happened at the last meeting, at the August meeting. Although we did discuss it in the subcommittee, so I think that could be easily added.
Okay. All right. So an item would be to add that the mention of doing the sensitivity analysis into this text. Okay. Thanks, Catherine.
Since you called on me with my comment in the chat, I'll just add that with great appreciation to the committee for all the work they did to get to these recommendations. And with apologies to whoever actually drafted this language, I found it really jargony and hard to follow. And I did send Jane a bunch of comments in that regard to hopefully this is a really extremely important concept in terms of how the model is run. And I think it needs to be written in a way that could be understood by people who don't understand discount rates and present value concepts. And as it's presented right now, I don't think we've quite gotten there. And so I offer that comment, but I don't want it in any way to seem critical of all of the work that got us to this decision point, because it's clear that it was a lot of really critical thinking that led us here.
Thanks, Catherine. Great. June, go ahead, please.
I just want to thank Catherine for the way she presented that critique. This is an area that I find is almost inescapably bound up with this kind of jargon. And this is one of the continuing problems that we have in our society, that so many things that matter to us a great deal have become very difficult to follow and to immerse yourself in because there's such jargon. So we can certainly do everything we can, Catherine, to address that. And I don't think anybody on that committee would take exception to the way you've raised your you've brought us your feedback.
Great. Is anything else about what's been TJ's put out there so far? So I'm hearing two things that folks would like to see adjusted or improved. One is let's add in specific reference to the sensitivity analysis is something we want to see happen. And let's take a stab at doing a little more plain English version of this if possible, in any way possible. So those are two things I've heard. And before we just say, TJ, please go forth and do that. Was anybody concerned about those two? Would folks feel, I'm just doing my notes here, folks, that look like this. If folks aren't comfortable with those changes as marching orders for those who are going to rewrite, please lift up your voice now. Great. Okay. All right. So TJ, I wonder if if there's other pieces of this you need to present. I think there was a missing piece, right? That you wanted to talk about.
Right. Just summarizing the work of the committee on the cost of carbon model. So the Public Service Department for the last couple of years has published that cost effectiveness model, that is the cost per ton of carbon dioxide saved by various technologies. It was done as part of our annual energy report, which is meant to show progress and provide recommendations to further the comprehensive energy plan goals. And the technical consultant reviewed that and found it valuable for understanding near-term investments and cost and the technologies, and exactly as it was intended. There was a number of improvement recommended, both to specific assumptions and then more broadly to including more longer term duration and the potential for different technologies to actually contribute to the mix. There's some technologies that are super cost effective but don't do much for greenhouse gas emissions, and so that leads to the development of what is called, here's a jargony term also, but a mitigation policy supply curve, where you kind of stack the cost-effective investments. I see you there, Chris. Thank you. I blew one person's mind today. That'd be good. But it stacks the cost effectiveness of each different action and the potential for that action going forward. But ultimately, the committee really just recommended that the council doesn't need to take further action on the specific cost of carbon report of the department, but it did recommend that that the state of Vermont and the committee, let me just make sure I get the language right, that that Vermont is how it's phrased, continue to maintain and update for and account for mitigation pathways through reasonable means. And so the idea was to not tie the council or the state into one specific model that may have different advantages, but also initially through the technical consultant to create that mitigation supply curve that I was talking about, and then have that be updated in the future as a tracking and monitoring tool and used going forward. And so the technical consultant is on task to do that in the modeling, and then we can update it through, the LEAP modeling that's being done, or the department's tool, or another tool that may turn out to be even better than those. And so it just allows for a little flexibility.
Great. Okay. Thanks, TJ. Appreciate that. Again, any questions for TJ about what's being put forward as a recommendation coming out of this subcommittee? Any questions about that? Okay. All right. So why don't we just do the 1, 2, 3 one more time on this, just so we nail it and feel confident in us. So again, drop in the chat, please. 1, if you're feeling good about this. 2, if you have some concerns, but you can live with it. 3, if you have concerns that don't allow you to live with this right now. Again, this is social cost of carbon. I'm sharing my screen again with the notes, which are the feedback and the changes that you are looking for again. And so the 1, 2, 3 is assuming these changes are done as requested. Okay. I, like you, am watching the chat here. Thanks, folks. Thanks, TJ, and the science data subcommittee on this one. Okay, I'm not seeing 3s, folks. So with that, let's take this as adopted by you all. Thanks so much. And we have those 2 action items to do going back for teaching.
David, can I just ask for clarification for the committee science and data meeting tomorrow? Does this need to, so we're going to make those changes as requested, and then is the expectation that this is going to be, we're done? Is it presented again? Is it, what's the next step?
I'm glad you asked that, because it speaks to our process at this point. And our process at this point is the instructions, like the feedback, you make those changes, those will be posted online for folks to see. And then when a consolidated version of the initial cap is presented, we'll see it all, right? We're going to see it all. And so it's not like we are done, but what we have tried to do now is lift up any concerns that are really mission critical concerns, so that when we have this consolidated plan and really do the final, yep, we can live with this, this is our plan, we've already figured out if we have some concerns. And here we're not seeing concerns. We see 2 issues that we'd like science and data to work on in a revised version. Jane, please correct me if I'm making a mess of things.
You're right on, David. Thank you. And just a reminder, so folks know, by next Tuesday, the plan is 1 week after these components are reviewed by you all, that, and this happened after the last time we reviewed components, an updated clean version is posted, as well as a track change version. So there are 2, a final clean and a track changed version, so folks can see how comments were incorporated. And I'll work with TJ and others to ensure that is done for next week.
Great. Perfect. Okay, great. All right, so we got one more thing here before we do public comment, and that is a number of sections of texts that correspond to the Science and Data Subcommittee were prepared and were part of the packet for this meeting. And Jared, I think you were just going to give people a heads up what they were and point folks to them. This is an opportunity for us to provide, as a council, for you all to provide some feedback, if you have any feedback on the way that drafting has occurred. But Jared, let me turn it over to you to just say a few words about what these pieces of text are.
Sure, thanks, David. So the first one that's referenced in the agenda is really just an introductory paragraph talking about the importance that we place in terms of our work as a council and the climate action plan being developed in light of and guided by the latest available and best available science and data, and that one example or one illustration of the importance of that commitment by the council was the decision to create a subcommittee that was not named in statute, but that was a full subcommittee explicitly devoted to science and data. So it's really just that first one is literally just one paragraph of context setting before we go into a section that has some fairly technical and science and data related topics with regard to the social cost of carbon, cost of carbon reduction model, greenhouse gas inventory, carbon budget, etc.
Thanks. And the pieces of text that were being reviewed now are that intro paragraph kind of thing, yep. And then the write-up on the greenhouse gas inventory that the council, you all agreed to the recommendations 2 meetings back or 3 meetings back.
For context on that, like my inclination would not be to go through that, because this is actually the 3rd time that the council has seen that language. So there were the original recommendations about the greenhouse gas inventory that were presented on September 15th. As part of that conversation, we went back and had a number of conversations with the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which led to that recommendation around issuing an RFP that subsequently got added to the GHG recommendations, but nothing else in our recommendations changed as part of that. So the language was the same, both when the council saw it in September and in October, and that's the basis for that section that is going to go in the cap. We didn't want to try to create new recommendations. It was the consensus recommendations that had already been approved by the subcommittee and the full council in October. So there's really not much of anything new there.
Great. Great. Okay, so this is an opportunity if folks, when you read those sections, if there's anything in the drafting of them that you'd want to provide feedback, so that if the science and data folks get that feedback in any sort of final versions. So when folks read these texts, is there anything you want to flag up to Jared now in the subcommittee so they can take that back? Anything? Okay, great. And again, the content has already been approved by you several weeks ago in terms of the greenhouse gas content. Okay, so I'm not hearing specific feedback on that, and that's great. So thanks, Jared, and everybody who was involved in that drafting. it's nice to see pieces of the puzzle come together. Okay.
No, David, I'm sorry to do this. I just forgot one thing that we did change. I think it's very minor and not likely to have any, impact on the result. We did change one thing in the subcommittee, which was the previous recommendation was that the additional analysis, including the sensitivity analysis, be applied to the next inventory. We realized the next greenhouse gas inventory, we realized that was an oversight and changed that to future inventories, so that the additional sensitivity analysis and other recommendations are intended to be on a going forward basis, not just one point in time.
Got it. Right. And very much the intent, right, of
yeah, that was the intent all along. We just noticed that it wasn't clear in the language, so updated that.
Thanks. Okay. Last chance on any comments on the way that text's been drafted. Okay. Wonderful. All right. So thanks, everyone. This is an opportunity for us to pause, and we've got 50-something folks with us today, which is great. And this is an opportunity for us to do some public comment around all these issues we've been dealing with today, starting with our conversations on how we're doing this equitably, and now some of these substantive conversations. And so I invite folks who've joined us today who would like to make a comment. This is a good time to do it. Let's use the hand raise function in Zoom, which is down in the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. And the first thing right above there is raise hand. So I invite you to do that. If you're having a hard time doing raise hand, you can also just try to get my attention some other way in the chat, or even if you just need to unmute yourself and shout out and say, hey, I can't figure it out. Let's do a little bit of public comment here. So if you're observing us and would like to provide some input on all this hard work of the council, now's a great time. And if you're on the phone, I believe it's star, oh, I don't want to get this wrong. Cam, is it star 6 or star 9?
It's
unmute yourself.
Yeah, star 6.
Star 6 unmutes yourself if you're on the phone. So folks are joining us just on the phone today and would like to make a comment, you can do that. There's a way to raise your hand in the chat and on the phone too, which I think is star 9. But feel free to unmute yourself and if you're trying to get in today. So I'm not seeing hands for public comment today. I'll just note that. Oh, go ahead. I see a hand now. Jeff Ford, please go ahead.
I want to thank the council for the hard work that you guys are doing. You really are doing some really important and difficult work. The one concern that I would have in the presentations today is the proportionality of the electric sector on our greenhouse gas emissions. It's at 2% in 2018, as I believe is one of the things that was presented under the proportionality piece of that. And I would question how that is calculated. While we are touted as having a very green electric mix, a lot of that greenness is purchased from out of state, and the electricity that we use, particularly the additional marginal electricity that we use, is coming from ISO New England, which is over 75% natural gas at any given point in time for the region. So you know, how that proportionality is used in the electric sector, I think will be important going forward in a variety of different venues. And that's a number that I would question.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for that comment. I appreciate that. Are there other folks today who've been observing our meeting who would like to offer a comment? And thanks for using this. Feel free to use the chat, just like what Ben just did. Feel free to use the chat as a place to make a comment in this period as well. Okay. All right, so I'm not seeing additional hands today. And I really do appreciate everyone who's signed in and observed this meeting today and paid attention to this important work going on. Thank you for doing this. It's tough on Zoom, so we really appreciate everybody weighing in and listening in. Okay. Next steps. Well, we are meeting weekly now, so we'll see you next Tuesday, and we will be looking at the cross-sector mitigation pieces. And Jane probably put her hand up to help frame this up. I will say that this is one of the weeks where we're going to fall short on the number of days you have to review the materials. And Jane can confirm, but I believe you will receive the materials that will be the cross-sector mitigation pathway strategy action packet on Friday. And that gives us just a few days to look them over. So that's an apology from us. And as you can recognize, everybody's working at full throttle to try to get this done, but apologies about that. And that'll be the context of our Tuesday meeting, as well as a shorter number of days to review that material. Jane, and then Secretary Young.
I was just going to tee that up, David, so thank you for that. So the materials will be posted by end of day on Friday. And I do just want to also draw your attention to that David and I met with the co-chairs of cross-sector earlier today to start to tee up what that conversation could look like. And in order to hopefully do that thoughtfully and use our time with all of you next week to tee up some of the issues, we will likely also be sending around a survey with those materials on Friday afternoon to gauge counselors' interest in particular subject areas so that we can be prepared to speak to questions and concerns on Tuesday. Cross-sector can. And then just quickly to maybe put some resolve on what we discussed earlier today, co-chairs have been speaking via email about process and format, and it does sound like cross-sector will stay the course on CAP drafting as the process has been laid out for them, and will work to revise a process that works for Ag and Eco and rural resilience by tomorrow, hopefully, to put forward clear deliverables for those subcommittees in the coming week.
Thanks, Jane. Great. And what we're talking about in terms of a survey that would accompany the materials on Friday is really to lift out from you the areas that you think require the conversation of the full council on Tuesday. So what really are the priority conversations that we should have as a full council on Tuesday? That'll be the emphasis of that survey that we aim to include in the Friday materials. Secretary Young?
Yeah, have we put out a draft agenda for next Tuesday yet? And if even if we have, should the agenda be amended to reflect the limited amount of time on a really key important section of the plan? I worry about putting in the agenda we're going to adopt something so significant with just a couple of business days or one business day to review it.
Just a reminder, we won't be adopting anything next week. These will be sections of the climate action plan. So similar to when Jared reviewed the green, yeah, it'll be contextual, starting to raise any red flags and gaps, but we'll have it, we won't adopt it until it comes forward with the complete climate action plan later in the month of November.
Okay, that's very helpful just to know what to expect. Thank you.
Okay. And that agenda has not been posted yet, but will be shortly. Okay. Great. Anything else in next steps? I'll ask that of Jane, Secretary Young, and others before we sign off today.
I will just say that we have a final public engagement write-up that I will be posting and sharing with you all. That is the final report following the presentation that you all saw last week.
Thanks, Jane. That's great. Jared?
If it's okay, I just briefly wanted to respond to the public comment that Jeff Ford offered, which I appreciate, and also that Ben Edgerly Walsh put in the chat. And I just want to remind and reassure folks that what the recommendation was around the reference year for sectoral proportionality was really just that. It was what year to choose. In terms of any changes to the GHG accounting methodology that may happen over time, or in terms of sensitivity analysis that may happen with regard to the results of the RFP that's going to be written and go out on upstream and life cycle emissions as a result of our energy use, both in the electricity sector and in the transportation and thermal sectors. That recommendation was not meant to bake in any methodology. We are committed, at least as I can confidently speak on behalf of the Science and Data Subcommittee in our greenhouse gas inventory recommendations, that as any data sources or methodologies can be improved for transparency and accuracy, we very much want to see those happen, and we are going to continue to be open to wanting to have different kind of lenses to view ways that we can understand our responsibility for emissions that may happen beyond Vermont as a result of Vermont's energy use. So while the renewable energy standard was referenced in that memo, there was no recommendation around locking in a way that we account for emissions from different sectors in there. It was really primarily to establish the reference year of 2018 and to address the question of how different objectives should be weighed alongside each other.
Great. Thanks, Jared. Appreciate that. Okay, folks, I think with that, we are done today. Really appreciate everybody being very engaged today, particularly right out of the box with that tough conversation around equity and inspiring conversation. So we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone, and take care. And thanks for a quick read of the materials that will come out your way on Friday, and for answering the survey that'll accompany it. Take care, folks. We'll see you next week, if not sooner.